Did you know that some medieval peasants produced more food per acre than many modern industrial farms? Or that a single monastery garden could feed hundreds of people year-round using techniques we now call sustainable. We look at their world of thatched roofs and dirt floors and assume we know better. We have science. We have technology. We have machines that do the work of 100 men. But what if, in our race for efficiency, we lost something fundamental? What if the secrets to a truly resilient garden aren't in a lab but buried in the past and the forgotten habits of people who lived and died by the soil? They didn't have chemical fertilizers or genetically modified seeds. They had their hands, their eyes, their wits, and generations of knowledge passed down. They had to make it or they would starve. That desperation bred a kind of genius, a practical, earthy wisdom that we've almost completely forgotten. So, what did they know that we don't? How did they manage to grow so much with so little? Number 20, why did they build walls for their beans? It seems simple, almost childish. A low fence made of woven sticks? We see them in old paintings of medieval gardens, quaint and rustic. We call them wattle fences. They look like decoration, a way to mark a boundary. But they were much more than that. They were a critical piece of technology, an active part of the garden ecosystem. A medieval gardener wouldn't just build a fence around their plot. They would build smaller wattle structures inside the garden, often in zigzag patterns or as small circular enclosures. Why go to all that trouble? Because the fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a tool. First, it was a windbreak. In a world without massive forests tamed into neat rows, wind could be a destructive force. It dried out the soil and battered young plants. A low wattle fence, usually just a foot or two high, was enough to disrupt the airflow at ground level. This created a pocket of still, warm air right where the seedlings were most vulnerable. Think of it as a microclimate. The temperature inside the wattle enclosure could be several degrees warmer than the surrounding area. This was a huge advantage in the cool, damp climates of places like England or northern France. It meant you could plant earlier in the spring and extend your growing season later into the fall. The difference of a few degrees could be the difference between a harvest and a failure. This principle is still used today in what agricultural scientists call windbreak technology. A 2011 study in the journal Agriculture, Ecosystems, and Environment confirmed that even small windbreaks can increase soil moisture and crop yield significantly, sometimes by as much as 20%. The medieval farmer didn't need a scientific journal, they just needed to watch their plants. Second, the wattle was a trellis. It was a built-in support system for climbing plants like peas and beans. Instead of having to set up individual stakes for each plant, the gardener had a ready-made structure. The plants would naturally climb the woven branches, lifting themselves up towards the sun. This saved space, a precious commodity in a small kitchen garden, and it also improved air circulation around the plants, which helped prevent fungal diseases like mildew. Modern gardeners still use trellises, of course, but we often buy them as separate plastic or metal items. The medieval approach integrated the fence and the support system into one single, biodegradable structure. When the wattle fence started to rot after a few years, it wasn't thrown away. It was laid down on the garden bed to decompose, returning its nutrients to the soil. It was a closed-loop system. The materials were free and abundant, coppicing the practice of cutting back certain trees like hazel or willow to encourage the growth of new, straight stems was a cornerstone of medieval land management. These long, flexible stems were the perfect material for weaving wattle. A gardener could harvest what they needed from the local woods without killing the trees. In fact, regular coppicing keeps the trees healthy and productive for centuries. Some coppiced woodlands in England have been continuously harvested since the Roman era. It was a truly sustainable source of building material. People like the historian Oliver Rockham, in his book The History of the Countryside, detailed how deeply integrated these practices were. It wasn't just about gardening, it was about managing the entire landscape as a single productive system. So, that simple woven fence was a climate moderator, a space-saving plant support, and a source of future soil fertility, all built from free, sustainably harvested materials. It was a quiet, brilliant piece of engineering, but here are the questions that remain. We know wattle changes the physical environment, but does the specific type of wood used, like willow, which contains rooting hormones, subtly influence the growth of the plants it supports? Could the slow decomposition of the wattle in place create a unique fungal network that benefits the surrounding soil in ways we haven't yet measured. And as it breaks down, does it release a slow, steady stream of specific micronutrients that are perfectly timed for the needs of the crops growing alongside it? Number 19, why did they listen to the moon? This one sounds like folklore, like superstition. Planting by the phases of the moon. It's easy for us to dismiss it. We have soil science and meteorology. What could the moon possibly have to do with a carrot? Yet, for thousands of years, from the ancient Egyptians to the medieval European peasant, planting by the moon was not a fringe belief. It was standard agricultural practice. It was recorded in almanacs and passed down through generations. Was it all just a collective delusion, or were they observing something real? The core idea is simple. The moon's gravitational pull affects the tides in the ocean. That's a massive, undeniable physical force. The theory of lunar planting suggests that this same pull also affects the water in the soil and the sap in plants. It's a much subtler effect, but the logic is there. The belief was that as the moon waxes, from new to full, the gravitational pull increases, drawing moisture up in the soil. This is the time to plant crops that produce their fruit above ground, like beans, squash, and tomatoes. The increased sap flow and soil moisture would, in theory, encourage strong leaf and stem growth. Conversely, as the moon wanes, from full to new, the gravitational pull lessens. The energy of the plant is thought to be drawn downwards into the root system. This is the time to plant root crops like carrots, potatoes, and turnips. The new moon and full moon were seen as times of transition, often reserved for weeding or soil preparation. This wasn't just a vague feeling, it was a detailed system. Texts from the period like the Japonica, 10th century Byzantine text that compiled earlier Greek and Roman agricultural knowledge, contained specific instructions about which tasks to perform during which lunar phase. This knowledge was widespread. Charlemagne, the powerful emperor who ruled much of Western Europe around 800 AD, was known to consult lunar calendars for agricultural planning. It was considered practical wisdom, not magic. Modern science has been skeptical, to say the least. Many studies have failed to find a conclusive link between lunar phases and plant growth. But the story isn't that simple. Maria Thun, a German researcher who began her work in the 1950s, conducted decades of experiments. Her results, published annually in her biodynamic sowing and planting calendar, claimed to show consistent, measurable differences in the growth and quality of plants sown according to specific lunar and astrological calendars. While her work is often dismissed by mainstream science for its connection to Rudolf Steiner's biodynamic philosophy, her meticulous data collection over 50 years is hard to ignore completely. More recently, studies on the subtle effects of gravity and electromagnetism on seed germination have started to appear. A 2014 study in the Journal of Agricultural Science suggested that weak magnetic fields, which can be influenced by lunar cycles, might affect seed germination rates. The science is far from settled, but it's no longer being dismissed out of hand. Perhaps the medieval farmer wasn't just tracking gravity, the moon also affects light. A plant's life is governed by light. Photoperiodism, how plants respond to the length of day and night, is a well-understood scientific principle. The nights around a full moon are significantly brighter than the nights around a new moon. Could this small amount of extra light, especially during the critical germination phase for seeds planted near the surface, be enough to make a difference? For tiny seedlings, a little extra light energy could be a significant boost. It's a plausible biological mechanism that doesn't require us to believe in mystical forces. So they watched the sky, they saw a connection between the great clock of the cosmos and the tiny seeds in their hand. They built a system around it that lasted for centuries. We, with all our technology, are still arguing about whether they were right. But think about this. If the moon's gravity can subtly affect the water table, could it be influencing the deep soil microbial and fungal networks that are essential for plant health in ways we can't yet detect? Are there subtle hormonal or enzymatic processes in seeds that are triggered not just by water and warmth, but by minute changes in gravitational or electromagnetic fields? And what if the real benefit wasn't about gravity or light at all, but about rhythm? What if simply having a universal celestial calendar for planting, weeding, and harvesting imposed a beneficial discipline on the entire community, preventing people from planting too early or harvesting too late? Number 18, why did they bury clay pots in the ground? Imagine trying to keep a garden alive through a dry summer without a hose. No sprinkler systems. No convenient tap. Just a few feet away, you had a well stream or a rain barrel. Every drop of water was precious. They had to be carried, often over long distances. Wasting, it wasn't an option. So medieval gardeners, particularly in drier regions like Spain and southern France, used a technique that is both ancient and incredibly clever. They buried unglazed clay pots called ollas in their garden beds. An olla is a simple teardrop-shaped terracotta pot. It's unglazed, which is the crucial part. This means the clay is porous, it can sweat. The gardener would bury the olla in the soil up to its neck, leaving just the opening exposed. They would then fill the pot with water and plant their seedlings around it. What happened next is a beautiful example of passive demand-driven irrigation. The soil around the olla was dry. The water inside the olla was wet. Through a process called soil moisture tension, the dry soil would literally pull the water through the microscopic pores in the clay pot. The water would seep out slowly, drop by drop, directly into the root zone of the nearby plants. And it was incredibly efficient. Unlike surface watering, where much of the water evaporates before it can be used or runs off without sinking in, all irrigation loses almost nothing to evaporation. The water is delivered underground, right where the plants need it, and the system is self-regulating. When the soil is moist, as after a rain, the tension is low, and very little water is pulled from the pot. When the soil dries out, the tension increases and more water is drawn out. The plants get exactly the amount of water they need when they need it. This encourages deep root growth as the roots are drawn towards the consistent moisture source, making the plants more resilient to drought. This technology is ancient, predating medieval Europe by thousands of years. Evidence of its use has been found in China and North Africa, dating back over 4,000 years. But it was a standard part of the toolkit for a savvy medieval gardener facing dry conditions. It allowed them to grow food in places, and during times that would otherwise be impossible. It saved an enormous amount of labor and water. Studies by agricultural researchers today have confirmed the effectiveness of this ancient method. A 2013 study at the University of New Mexico found that using ollas can reduce water consumption by 50 to 70% compared to conventional surface watering, while still producing a healthy crop. Making ollas was a local craft. Every region had potters who could turn local clay into these essential gardening tools. They were cheap, durable, and made from the earth itself. Today, you can buy modern versions, but the principle is identical to the pot buried in a monastery garden 1,000 years ago. It's a technology with no moving parts, that requires no electricity, and that works in perfect harmony with the laws of physics and the needs of plants. You fill it every few days, and it does the rest. It is the definition of appropriate technology. But it makes you wonder, does the slow seepage of water from a clay pot create a unique microbial environment around the roots, a kind of living skin in the soil that we don't see with flood or drip irrigation? Could the minerals from the clay itself, like iron oxide, slowly leach into the soil, providing a steady supply of micronutrients to the plants? And is it possible that the constant, stable moisture level provided by an olla prevents the stress cycles of wet and dry that modern watering methods cause, leading to a healthier plant in ways beyond simple hydration? Number 17. Why did they value their garbage so much? In the modern world, we think of waste as something to get rid of. We put it in a bin, and a truck takes it away. But in the medieval world, there was no away. Everything came from the land, and eventually, everything went back to the land. A household's waste wasn't just garbage, it was a future resource. At the heart of this was the midden heap. A midden was essentially the designated spot for all the household's organic waste. It wasn't a hidden, shameful place. It was often a specific managed pile somewhere near the house or garden. Into this pile went everything. Kitchen scraps were the most obvious: vegetable peels, spoiled food, eggshells, bones. But it was much more than that. It was also floor sweepings, which contained dust, dirt, shed hair, and bits of food. It was the old straw bedding from the animals, full of manure and urine. It was the ash from the hearth, full of potassium and other minerals. It was old, worn-out clothing made of wool or linen, which would break down over time. It was even the contents of the chamber pot, the night soil. This sounds disgusting to our modern, sanitized sensibilities. But to the medieval gardener, it was black gold. They understood through generations of observation that this rotting pile of refuse was the key to fertile soil. They didn't know about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the chemical sense. but they knew that spreading the dark, crumbly material from the bottom of an old midden heap onto their garden beds resulted in bigger, healthier plants. They were composting, they were closing the nutrient loop, nothing was wasted. Sir Albert Howard, a British botanist working in India in the early 20th century, is often called the father of modern organic agriculture. He developed the indoor method of composting, a systematic way of layering green materials like kitchen scraps with brown materials like straw and wood ash to create high-quality compost. But as he himself acknowledged, he wasn't inventing something new. He was observing and systemizing practices that Indian farmers and their medieval European counterparts had been using for centuries. They knew that a good compost pile needed a mix of different materials. They knew it needed to be turned occasionally to let air in. They knew it took time. The scale of this was impressive. Archaeological digs of medieval villages, like the famous Warren Percy site in Yorkshire, England, often reveal the locations of these middens. The soil in these areas is still remarkably dark and fertile 1,000 years later. The practice wasn't just for small households. Castles and monasteries had enormous middens to process the waste from hundreds of people. The resulting compost was used to fertilize the extensive gardens and fields that supported the community. This constant recycling of nutrients was essential. They weren't buying bags of fertilizer. They had to create their own fertility. This meant that the health of their garden was directly linked to how well they managed their waste. A well-managed household, with its animals and its garden, was a self-contained, self-fertilizing system. The food fed the people and animals. The waste from the people and animals fed the soil. The soil fed the next crop of food. It was a perfect circle. So as we struggle with overflowing landfills and nutrient-depleted soils, we are slowly rediscovering the wisdom of the midden heap. We call it composting, and we act like it's a modern, eco-friendly invention. It's not. It's an ancient survival strategy. But what did they not know? We understand the basic chemistry, but do we understand the microbiology? Could the specific blend of waste in a medieval midden, especially the inclusion of human and animal manure, have cultivated a unique and incredibly potent community of bacteria and fungi that modern, more sterile composting methods lack? What if the long, slow, low-temperature decomposition process in a midden preserved certain microbial relationships that are destroyed in the high heat, rapid composting we favor today? And could the constant addition of wood ash have had effects beyond just adding potassium, perhaps, by altering the pH in a way that selected for a very specific beneficial type of decomposer organism? Number 16, why were their gardens such a jumble? Walk into a modern vegetable garden and you'll likely see order. Straight rows. Carrots in this bed, lettuce in that one, beans over there. It's neat, tidy, and easy to manage. It's a monoculture on a small scale. A medieval kitchen garden or potagerie would have looked very different. It would have seemed chaotic, a jumble of plants all growing together, flowers mixed in with vegetables. Herbs tucked in next to root crops, a tall stalk of lovage shading a patch of thyme. It looked messy, but it was a carefully designed chaos. This practice is what we now call polyculture or companion planting. The idea is that certain plants, when grown together, help each other out. The medieval gardener didn't have access to scientific journals on allelopathy, the chemical interactions between plants, but they had centuries of trial and error. They knew what worked. They observed that planting strong-smelling herbs like rosemary or sage among their brassicas like cabbage and kale seemed to confuse the cabbage butterflies that would otherwise decimate their crop. The powerful scent of the herbs masked the smell of the cabbages. Today we know this is because many insect pests locate their host plants through specific volatile organic compounds. By mixing in other plants with different scent profiles, you effectively jam their signal. They knew that planting legumes like peas and beans next to heavy feeding crops like corn or leafy greens made the other plants grow better. They didn't know about nitrogen fixing bacteria living in nodules on the legume roots, but they saw the result. The beans were, in effect, fertilizing their neighbors. This is the basis of the famous Three Sisters planting method used by Native Americans' corn for structure. Beans to climb the corn and add nitrogen, squash to shade the ground and suppress weeds, but similar principles were at play in European gardens. Flowers weren't just for decoration, they were an essential part of the system. Calendula and marigolds were planted throughout the garden because they were known to repel certain nematodes in the soil. They also attracted beneficial insects. Hoverflies and lacewings, whose larvae are voracious predators of aphids, are drawn to the nectar in the flowers. The flowers were a biological pest control service. Borage was planted near strawberries because it was thought to improve their flavor and vigor, and it also attracts pollinators. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess and polymath, wrote extensively in her work Physica about the relationships between plants, describing their virtues, and how they could be used together for both medicine and gardening. This jumbled up garden was also a resilient system. In a neat monoculture row, if a pest or disease finds one plant, it has a clear runway to destroy the entire crop. In a diverse polyculture garden, the target plants are separated by other species. This slows the spread of pests and diseases. The diversity of plants also created a more complex and stable ecosystem both above and below ground. Different plants have different root structures, drawing nutrients from different levels of the soil. This diversity of roots supported a more diverse community of soil microbes, which in turn led to healthier soil. A 2017 meta-analysis published in the journal Nature Plants reviewed dozens of studies and found that plant species diversity consistently increases ecosystem productivity. The medieval gardener proved this principle in their backyard every day. So their gardens weren't messy. They were complex, interactive communities where each member played a role. It was a system designed for resilience, not just for tidy aesthetics, but what are the hidden connections we still haven't mapped? We know about nitrogen fixation and pest deterrence, but are there more subtle interactions happening? Do the root systems of certain plants exude chemical signals that trigger disease resistance or enhance nutrient uptake in their neighbors? Could the fungal networks, the mycorrhizae in the soil, be forming more complex and beneficial partnerships in a diverse garden than in a monoculture, sharing nutrients between different species in ways we are only just beginning to understand? What if a messy garden is creating a level of soil biodiversity so complex that it provides a kind of collective immunity to the whole system, a benefit that is completely lost the moment we plant in neat single species rows? Number 15, why do they treat weeds like food? We spend billions of dollars a year trying to eradicate weeds. We spray them, pull them, curse them. To us, a weed is a plant in the wrong place. To a medieval peasant, a weed was often just another plant. A plant you didn't have to waste energy planting. A plant that was often the first green thing to appear in the spring and the last to die back in the fall. Many of the plants we call weeds today were a regular and important part of the medieval diet. Take the dandelion. Today, it's the scourge of suburban lawns. In medieval Europe, it was a prized vegetable. The young leaves were harvested in the spring for salads or cooked like spinach. They were one of the first sources of fresh greens after a long winter of preserved foods, providing much needed vitamin C to ward off scurvy. The roots could be roasted and ground to make a coffee-like beverage. The flowers were used to make wine. Every part of the plant was used. Its name in French, pissenlit, literally pisson bed, refers to its powerful diuretic properties, which were well understood by medieval herbalists. Nettles are another great example. We think of their sting, they thought of their nutrition. Stinging nettles, when cooked, lose their sting and become a highly nutritious green, rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins. They were used to make soup, a common peasant dish, and even beer. The tough fibers from the mature stalks were used to make a type of cloth similar to linen. It was a food, a medicine, and a textile, all growing for free at the edge of the field. Lamb's quarters, or fat hen, is another weed that was a staple food. It's a relative of spinach and quinoa, and is incredibly productive and nutritious. It would spring up in disturbed soil like a newly tilled garden bed, and would be harvested and eaten, not discarded. This approach wasn't born out of sentimentality. It was born out of necessity. In a world where crop failure was a constant threat, wild, self-seeding plants were a reliable backup. They were tough. They were adapted to the local soil and climate. They often required no work at all, other than the effort of harvesting them. The line between cultivated and wild was much blurrier than it is today. The garden was a semi-wild space, and the plants that chose to grow there were often welcomed, as long as they didn't completely overwhelm the main crops. This knowledge of wild edibles was common. It wasn't the domain of specialists. Everyone knew which plants you could eat. This knowledge is documented in the great herbals of the period, but it was primarily a living oral tradition. A book from the period, the Tachinum Sanitatis, a health handbook from the 14th century, contains illustrations of people gathering and preparing all sorts of common plants, many of which we would now call weeds. It shows them as a normal part of a healthy diet. By embracing these weeds, Medieval people also ensured a more diverse diet, which meant a wider range of nutrients. Modern diets are often criticized for their reliance on a very small number of staple crops. The medieval peasant, for all their hardships, likely consumed a much wider variety of plant species than the average person today. But this raises some interesting questions. Are these so-called weeds with their deep taproots like dandelions actually performing a vital service for the soil, breaking up compaction and drawing up minerals from deep underground that then become available to shallower-rooted crops when the weed dies and decomposes? Did the presence of these weeds support a different, perhaps more beneficial, community of pollinators and insects than our modern sterile gardens? And could it be that by constantly eating small amounts of these wild plants, with their diverse array of phytochemicals, medieval people were consuming a range of compounds that subtly supported their immune systems and overall health in ways that our clean food supply no longer does? It's number 14. How did they keep their seeds from dying? There were no seed catalogs, no online stores, no garden centers. If a medieval gardener wanted to grow something, they had one primary source for their seeds: last year's harvest. The seed saving wasn't a hobby for enthusiasts. It was a fundamental skill for survival. A failure to save good seeds, or to save them properly, meant you might have nothing to plant next spring. This reality forced a deep and intimate understanding of the plant life cycle. The process began long before the harvest. A good gardener was a constant observer. They would be watching their plants all season, looking for the healthiest, most productive individuals. Which bean plant produced the most pods? Which cabbage head was the largest and slowest to bolt? Which pea vine was the most resistant to mildew? These were the plants that were chosen to be the parents of the next generation. They would often be marked with a bit of colored string or cloth. This is selective breeding in its most basic and effective form. Over generations, this practice created countless local varieties, or landraces, of vegetables. Each one was perfectly adapted to the specific soil, climate, and pests of a particular village or region. This genetic diversity was a huge source of resilience. If a new disease swept through, some varieties might fail, but others would likely have a natural resistance and survive. The 19th century Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov, who pioneered the study of crop diversity, identified centers of origin, where this kind of farmer-led selection created the vast genetic heritage that our entire food system now depends on. Once the parent plants were selected, they were allowed to fully mature and go to seed. This often meant sacrificing a portion of the food harvest. The best-looking carrot wasn't eaten, it was left in the ground to flower the following year. The biggest pea pods were left on the vine to dry, not picked for dinner. This required discipline and foresight. Harvesting and storing the seeds was a careful process. The seeds had to be completely dry. Any moisture would lead to mold and rot over the winter. Seeds were laid out on cloths or wooden trays in a dry, airy place, away from direct sunlight. They were stored in clay pots, cloth bags, or wooden boxes, kept safe from mice and moisture. The knowledge of how to treat each type of seed was specific. Some seeds, like tomatoes, are encased in a gel-like substance that contains germination inhibitors. Medieval gardeners knew that they had to ferment these seeds in water for a few days to remove this coating before drying them, a process that modern seed savers still use. This constant cycle of selection and saving meant that the gardener wasn't just a passive consumer of seeds. They were an active participant in the evolution of their own food. They were shaping the plants to their needs and the needs of their specific place on Earth. When we buy a packet of hybrid seeds today, we get a uniform, productive crop for one generation. But the seeds saved from that crop will not grow true to type. We are forced to buy new seeds every year. We have outsourced our seed supply and, in the process, lost the skill and the genetic diversity that made the medieval system so robust. The work of organizations like the Seed Savers Exchange, founded in the 1970s, is a modern attempt to reclaim this lost heritage, preserving the heirloom varieties that are the direct descendants of the seeds saved in a medieval potager. But what subtleties have we lost? Did the practice of saving seeds from plants grown in the same soil year after year create epigenetic changes, modifications to how genes are expressed that made them uniquely suited to that specific microbial environment? Could a seed from a plant that successfully fought off a local fungal disease carry some kind of memory or inherited resistance that is passed to its offspring beyond just simple genetics? And is it possible that the constant handling of seeds, the physical connection, allowed gardeners to select for traits like seed coat thickness or density through touch and feel in ways that we, with our machine-processed seeds, no longer can? Number 13, what did fire have to do with a garden? After a long winter, the hearth was full of wood ash. For most of us, this would be a messy waste product to be disposed of. For the medieval gardener, it was a valuable soil amendment. Spreading wood ash on the garden beds in the spring was a common practice. They may not have had the language of chemistry, but they knew from experience that it worked. They were practicing a form of soil chemistry that modern science would later validate. Wood ash is a potent source of potassium, or potash. In fact, the word potassium comes from pot ash, referring to the practice of leaching the substance from wood ash in a pot. Potassium is one of the three major macronutrients that plants need for healthy growth, along with nitrogen and phosphorus. It plays a crucial role in water regulation, enzyme activation, and the formation of sugars and starches. A potassium deficiency can lead to weak stems, poor root development, and a low-quality harvest. By adding wood ash, the medieval gardener was giving their soil a direct dose of this essential nutrient. This was particularly important for fruiting crops like beans, squash, and later tomatoes, which have a high demand for potassium. But ash did more than just provide potassium. It also contains calcium, which is vital for cell wall structure, and a wide range of essential micronutrients like magnesium, iron, and manganese. It was a broad-spectrum mineral supplement for the soil. Furthermore, wood ash is alkaline. In regions with naturally acidic soil, like much of northern Europe where the soil is derived from granite and sandstone, adding ash would help to sweeten the soil, raising the pH. This makes many nutrients, which are locked up and unavailable to plants in acidic conditions, more accessible. It's the same principle as adding garden lime today, but they were using a free byproduct of staying warm. This wasn't just a garden scale practice. On a larger agricultural scale, a system known as slash and burn or swidden agriculture was used, especially in clearing new land. An area of forest or scrub would be cut down, the wood left to dry, and then burned. The resulting layer of ash would fertilize the soil for a few seasons of cropping. While this can be destructive if done unsustainably in a rotational system, it was an effective way of unlocking the nutrients stored in the forest biomass. The use of fire and ash as a soil management tool is ancient. The writings of the Roman agriculturalist Cato the Elder from the 2nd century BC describe the benefits of spreading ash on fields. A modern science has looked closely at this. The product we now call biochar is essentially a high-tech version of charcoal and ash. Biochar is created by heating organic material in a low-oxygen environment. Studies, like a comprehensive review in the journal GCB Bioenergy in 2015, have shown that adding biochar to soil can dramatically increase its fertility, improve its water-holding capacity, and provide a stable habitat for beneficial microbes. It also sequesters carbon in the soil for centuries. The medieval gardener, by adding ash and bits of charcoal from their hearth, was unknowingly practicing a simple form of biochar application, improving their soil structure and fertility for the long term. So the fire that cooked their food and heated their home also provided a powerful tool for feeding their garden. It was another closed loop in a system that wasted nothing. Yet, mysteries remain. We know the chemical composition of ash, but does the ash from different types of wood, oak versus birch versus pine have unique properties or micronutrient profiles that benefit different types of plants in specific ways? Could the fine, porous structure of ash and charcoal create a physical habitat for certain types of beneficial bacteria and fungi, effectively inoculating the soil? And is it possible that the shock of a highly alkaline substance being added to the soil triggers a specific response from the existing soil microbiome, perhaps stimulating the activity of organisms that are beneficial for plant growth? Number 12. Why did they let animals do the heavy lifting? Before the tractor, there was the ox. Before the rototiller, there was the pig. In the medieval world, livestock were not just a source of meat, milk, and wool. They were an integral part of the garden and farm ecosystem, providing labor and fertility in a way that no machine can fully replicate. Their role went far beyond simply pulling a plow in a large field. In a garden setting, smaller animals were key. In chickens and other poultry were the pest control team. After a crop was harvested, chickens would be allowed into the garden bed. They would scratch and peck, devouring insect larvae, slug eggs, and weed seeds. At the same time, their droppings would add a rich, high-nitrogen fertilizer to the soil. This practice, now called chicken tractoring by modern homesteaders who use movable pens, was a way to clean, debug, and fertilize a garden bed all in one step with minimal human effort. The 13th century English writer Walter of Henley, in his treatise on estate management, gave detailed advice on maximizing the value of the manure from every type of farm animal, noting the particular richness of poultry droppings. Pigs were the living rototillers. A pig's natural instinct is to root in the ground with its powerful snout, searching for roots and grubs. A few pigs could be turned into a fallow garden plot in the fall. Over a few weeks, they would turn over and aerate the soil more thoroughly than a man with a spade could. They would also eat any leftover crop roots and weed tubers like bindweed or couchgrass that would otherwise be a problem the following spring. And, of course, they would be manuring the plot the entire time. By the time the pigs were moved on, the bed would be tilled, weeded, and fertilized, ready for a winter cover crop or spring planting. On a slightly larger scale, the practice of folding was common. This involved penning sheep in a temporary enclosure or fold on a piece of cropland for a period of time. The sheep would graze on the stubble and weeds, and their concentrated manure and urine would intensely fertilize that patch of ground. The fold would then be moved to the next section. This was a systematic way of transferring the fertility from the pasture where the sheep grazed during the day to the arable fields where crops were grown. The Domesday Book of 1086, a massive survey of England, frequently mentions the rights and values associated with sheep folding, indicating how economically important this fertility transfer system was. The connection was direct and visible. The health of the animals and the health of the soil were two sides of the same coin. The crops fed the animals, and the animals fed the soil that grew the crops. This synergy is something we've lost in our modern specialized agriculture, where animal farming and crop farming are often two separate, disconnected industries, creating massive waste problems in one area and fertility deficits in the other. The medieval system, by necessity, was integrated, but this integration raises deeper questions. Does the fresh, unprocessed manure from an animal like a chicken or a pig introduce a living community of gut microbes directly into the soil, creating a more dynamic and effective soil food web than can be achieved with aged, sterile compost? Could the physical action of a pig's rooting or a chicken's scratching create a soil texture and structure that is uniquely beneficial for seed germination, a living tilth that machinery cannot replicate? And is it possible that the animals, through their selective grazing of weeds and leftover crops, were actively curating the plant life of the garden in a way that reduced disease and improved the health of the subsequent crop? Number 11. Why did they flatten their fruit trees? If you walked into the walled garden of a medieval castle or monastery, you might see something strange. Fruit trees like apples and pears, not growing in their natural bushy shape, but trained flat against the stone walls. Their branches would be stretched out horizontally like a candelabra or in a fan shape, reaching up and across the wall. This practice is called espalier. It looks like a purely decorative, artistic choice. But for the medieval gardener, it was a highly practical and productive technique. The stone or brick walls of the garden were not just boundaries, they were heat sinks. During the day, the wall would absorb the sun's energy. At night, it would slowly radiate that heat back out. This created a microclimate against the wall that was significantly warmer than the rest of the garden. By training a fruit tree flat against it, the gardener could effectively move their tree to a warmer climate zone. This meant they could grow fruits like peaches or certain varieties of pears that would normally not ripen in the cool climates of England or northern France. The added warmth also protected the delicate blossoms from late spring frosts, a common cause of crop failure. The open, flattened structure of an espaliered tree had other advantages. With all the branches spread out in a single plane, sunlight could reach every part of the tree. This led to better ripening, sweeter fruit. Air could also circulate freely around the leaves and fruit, which drastically reduced the incidence of fungal diseases like scab and mildew that thrive in the damp, stagnant air in the middle of a dense, standard tree. Pruning and harvesting were also much easier. There was no need for a tall ladder. All the fruit was within easy reach. This technique required skill and patience. It was a long-term project. The gardener would start with a young sapling and over several years carefully prune and tie the branches to a framework on the wall, gradually encouraging them into the desired shape. This intimate knowledge of how a tree grows and responds to pruning was a highly developed skill. The practice was particularly advanced in monastic communities. The monks had the continuity of knowledge passed down from one generation to the next, and the long-term stability to invest years in training a single tree. Records from monasteries, like the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, whose famous 9th century plan includes a detailed garden layout, show the importance of fruit cultivation in the monastic economy. Espalier also made the most of limited space. In a walled kitchen garden, every square foot was valuable. By growing fruit vertically against the walls, the open ground in the middle of the garden was left free for growing vegetables and herbs. It was a form of vertical gardening, a concept we think of as modern, but which has been practiced for centuries. A single wall could be turned into a highly productive orchard. Today, espalier is mostly seen as a horticultural art form, but it remains a practical technique for anyone with a small garden. You can grow a surprising amount of fruit in a narrow space against a wall or a fence. It's a living testament to the ingenuity of medieval gardeners who could look at a bare wall and see a future harvest. But does this practice do more than just warm the tree? Does the constant close contact with a stone wall change the tree's biology in other ways? Could the radiated heat from the stone at night alter the tree's metabolism, perhaps changing the sugar composition of the fruit? Does the highly structured, two-dimensional form of the tree change how hormones and nutrients are distributed, leading to physiological changes we don't fully understand? And is it possible that the wall itself, as it ages and hosts its own ecosystem of lichens and mosses, provides a unique microbial environment that benefits the tree and protects it from disease in ways a freestanding tree doesn't experience? Number 10. How did they get away with not plowing? The image of medieval farming is the heavy plow, pulled by a team of oxen, turning over long furrows of dark earth. And for large-scale grain farming, that was true, but in the kitchen garden, a different logic often applied. Many medieval gardeners practiced what we would now call a no-dig or no-till method. Instead of digging and turning the soil every year, they focused on building it up from the top. This was a system of layering, much like how a natural forest floor builds soil. The gardener would start with a defined bed, often raised and contained by wooden planks or wattle fences. They wouldn't dig into the native soil beneath. Instead, they would add layers of organic matter on top. A layer of night soil or manure, a layer of old straw or spoiled hay, a layer of kitchen scraps from the midden, a layer of leaves raked from the woods. This process, repeated year after year, created a bed of deep, dark, incredibly fertile soil. The soil life did the digging. Earthworms, beetles, fungi, and bacteria would work their way through these layers, breaking them down, mixing them, and creating a rich, spongy, well-aerated soil structure. This method had huge advantages. Firstly, it was less work. Tilling soil, even on a garden scale, is backbreaking labor. By simply adding material to the top, the gardener saved an enormous amount of energy. Secondly, it was better for the soil. The act of digging and tilling, while it seems to loosen the soil, can actually be very destructive. It destroys the delicate soil structure, breaks up the fine fungal networks, mycelial threads that are crucial for nutrient transport and can lead to compaction over time. It also exposes dormant weed seeds to the light, causing them to germinate. A no-dig bed, by contrast, has very few weeds. The thick layer of compost on top acts as a mulch, smothering any weeds that try to sprout from below. Any new weeds that arrive as seeds are easy to pull from the loose, friable surface. This approach also conserves water. The thick layer of organic matter on the surface acts like a sponge, soaking up rain and reducing evaporation. The soil stays more evenly moist, reducing the need for watering. The famous German abbess Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century wrote about the importance of viridis, or greening power, a concept that linked the vitality of the earth with the health of the plants. Building soil with layers of once living material was a way of concentrating this, viridis. Modern soil science is now confirming the wisdom of this ancient practice. Researchers like Dr. Elaine Ingham, a leading soil microbiologist, have spent decades documenting the complex soil food web. Her work shows that a healthy, undisturbed soil is a thriving ecosystem, and that practices like tilling are catastrophic events for this ecosystem. The no-dig method, promoted today by gardeners like Charles Dowding in the UK, is a direct revival of this medieval principle. Dowding's side-by-side trials, meticulously documented for years, consistently show that his undug beds produce higher yields with less work and fewer weeds than his dug beds. So the medieval gardener who simply piled their waste onto their garden beds wasn't being lazy. They were being smart. They were partnering with nature, feeding the soil life and letting the worms do the plowing. But this raises profound questions. We know no-dig methods preserve soil structure, but do they also preserve ancient microbial communities that have symbiotic relationships with specific plants, relationships that are completely shattered by tilling? Is it possible that the slow layered decomposition in a no-dig bed creates a unique chemical and biological gradient in the soil, from the fresh material on top to the rich humus below, that allows plants to access a wider range of nutrients as their roots grow downwards? And what if the undisturbed fungal networks in a no-dig garden are not just transporting nutrients, but are also acting as a communication network, allowing plants to send chemical signals to each other about pest attacks or nutrient deficiencies? Number 9, what did they know about making sick plants better? When a modern plant gets sick, we often reach for a chemical spray, a fungicide, an insecticide, a miticide. The medieval gardener had no such options. They had to rely on observation, prevention, and remedies made from the plants and materials they had on hand. This led to a form of plant health care that was gentle, holistic, and surprisingly effective. They made teas for their plants. Just as they made herbal teas to treat human ailments, they made botanical infusions and decoctions to treat their crops. This practice was rooted in the same body of knowledge found in the great medieval herbals. They believed that the properties that made a plant medicinal for a person could also make it beneficial for another plant. A common example is nettle tea. A large bunch of stinging nettles would be steeped in a barrel of water for a week or two. The resulting dark, smelly liquid was a potent fertilizer rich in nitrogen and iron. They're diluted and watered onto the base of plants. It acted as a powerful tonic, encouraging lush, green growth. Comfrey was another key plant. Its deep roots pull up nutrients from far below the surface, concentrating them in its leaves. A tea made from comfrey leaves is incredibly rich in potassium, making it the perfect feed for flowering and fruiting plants. But these teas were more than just simple fertilizers. They were also thought to boost a plant's defenses. A tea made from horsetail equisetum arvens, a common weed, is high in silica. When sprayed on the leaves of a plant, it was believed to strengthen the plant's cell walls, making them physically tougher and more resistant to fungal attacks like mildew. And modern science confirms. The silica is now recognized as a beneficial substance that can enhance plant health and resistance to both disease and pests. They also use plants as repellents. A spray made from steeping wormwood or rhubarb leaves in water was used to deter aphids and other sucking insects. They didn't know about the specific alkaloids and sesquiterpene lactones that make these plants bitter and toxic to insects, but they saw the effect. Another powerful tool came from the willow tree. A tea made from the bark of a willow tree contains salicylic acid, the natural precursor to aspirin. When used as a soil drench or a spray, salicylic acid can trigger a response in plants called systemic acquired resistance SAR. This is like a plant's immune system being put on high alert, making it better able to fight off a wide range of bacterial and fungal infections. The medieval gardener who used willow bark tea to help a struggling plant was, in effect, giving it a vaccination. This was documented in a way by Albertus Magnus in the 13th century in his work De Vegetabilis, where he described the sympathies and antipathies between different plants and substances. This approach was fundamentally different from ours. It was less about killing the pest or the disease directly, and more about strengthening the plant so it could defend itself. It was about promoting health, not just fighting sickness. It was a proactive, supportive medicine, not a reactive, aggressive one. But we are only scratching the surface of understanding how this works. If a simple tea from one plant can trigger a complex immune response in another, what other plant-to-plant signaling are we missing? Could the fermentation process in a barrel of nettle tea be creating a unique brew of beneficial microbes, a sort of probiotic for the soil that is just as important as the nutrients? And what if the combination of different herbs in some of these traditional recipes creates a synergistic effect, where the whole is far more powerful than the sum of its parts, working on multiple biological pathways in the plant at once? Number 8, why do they always plant the same thing in a different place? A gardener who plants their cabbages in the same patch of soil year after year will notice a problem. The first year, the harvest is good. The next year, it's a little worse. After a few years, the plants are stunted and riddled with disease. The medieval gardener knew this. They understood through hard-won experience that you couldn't plant the same thing in the same place indefinitely. they practiced crop rotation. This wasn't a haphazard process, it was a systematic plan to move different types of plants around the garden or fields over a cycle of several years. A common and highly effective system was the three-field system, which became widespread in Europe by the time of Charlemagne around 800 AD. One field would be planted with a winter grain like wheat or rye. A second field would be planted in the spring with crops like peas, beans, or lentils. The third field would be left fallow to rest and recover. The next year, the crops would be rotated. The field that had the beans would get the wheat field would be left fallow, and the fallow field would get the beans. This cycle would continue over 3 years. This system was brilliant for several reasons. First, it managed soil fertility. Different plants have different nutritional needs. The grains like wheat are heavy feeders, taking a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. The legumes like peas and beans do the opposite. They are givers. Through their partnership with rhizobia bacteria on their roots, they capture nitrogen from the air and fix it in the soil. By planting legumes in a field, the farmer was essentially growing their own fertilizer for the next year's grain crop. Leaving a field fallow, especially if it was grazed by animals who would add their manure, also allowed the soil to replenish its nutrients. Second, crop rotation breaks the life cycles of pests and diseases. Many pests and pathogens are host-specific. The insects that eat cabbage roots, for example, or the fungus that causes blight in potatoes, can build up in the soil over time. If you plant the same crop in the same spot, you are providing them with a reliable food source year after year, and their populations will explode. But if you move the cabbages to a different bed, the cabbage root fly larvae that hatch in the old bed will find nothing to eat and will starve. It's a simple but incredibly effective way to keep pest and disease pressure low without using any chemicals. Walter of Henley, the 13th century agricultural writer, explicitly advised rotating crops to maintain soil health, what he called keeping the land in good heart. In a kitchen garden, the rotation might be more complex, involving a 4 or 5 year plan. A common rotation might be legumes, peas, beans, followed by brassicas, cabbage, kale, followed by root vegetables, carrots, beets, followed by fruiting vegetable squash, and later, tomatoes. Each family of plants has different needs and is susceptible to different problems. By keeping them on the move, the gardener maintained a balance. This principle is one of the cornerstones of modern organic farming. The USDA's National Organic Program standards explicitly require crop rotation as a fundamental practice for building soil health and managing pests. We have rediscovered its importance, but for the medieval farmer, it was just common sense, a core principle of good husbandry passed down through generations. But does it go deeper? Does rotating crops with different root structures, a deep taproot like a carrot, followed by the fibrous root system of a grain, followed by the nitrogen-fixing nodules of a bean cultivate, a more diverse and resilient soil microbiome over time than any single crop ever could? Could the specific chemical residues or exudates left behind by one crop's roots actually stimulate the growth of beneficial microbes that the next crop in the rotation needs? And what if the fallow period wasn't just about rest, but was a crucial time for a unique community of wild plants and microbes to establish itself, performing a reset on the soil that we are only beginning to appreciate? Number 7. Who knew that a garden needed bees? Today we talk a lot about the pollinator crisis. We worry about the decline of bees and other insects and what it means for our food supply. For the medieval gardener, encouraging pollinators wasn't a cause, it was just part of the job. They understood that the journey from flower to fruit was not automatic. It required the help of insects, and they actively worked to make their gardens a welcoming place for them. While the precise mechanics of pollination weren't fully understood until the 18th century by naturalists like Christian Sprengel, the practical connection was clear. No bees, no apples, no flies, no carrots for seed. This understanding was woven into the design of their gardens. The medieval garden was never just a vegetable patch. It was always a mix of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Many of the flowers we think of as ornamentals were there for a reason. Plants like borage, hyssop, lavender, and thyme were grown for their culinary or medicinal uses, but they also happened to be magnets for bees and other beneficial insects. Their presence ensured that the nearby bean, pea, and squash blossoms would be pollinated effectively. They also provided habitat. A perfectly neat, manicured garden is a desert for many insects. The slightly messy medieval garden, with its wattle fences, compost heaps, and patches of uncultivated ground, provided countless nooks and crannies for insects to nest and overwinter. They didn't rake up every leaf in the fall. That leaf litter was a crucial habitat for queen bumblebees and other creatures. The hollow stems from last year's growth were left standing, providing nesting sites for solitary bees. And, of not least importance, they kept bees. Beekeeping was a common practice. Not in the modern white boxes with removable frames, but in coiled straw hives called skeps. A skep was a simple bell-shaped basket, often coated with a mixture of cow dung and mud to make it weatherproof. A small hole near the bottom was the entrance. The bees would build their natural looping combs inside, attached to the top and sides of the skep. To harvest the honey, the beekeeper would have to drive the bees out or suffocate them with sulfur fumes, and then cut out the honeycombs. It was a destructive process for the colony, but it provided the household with honey, a vital sweetener, and beeswax, which was used for everything from candles to sealing documents. Having a few skeps near the garden ensured a dedicated on-site pollination crew. Treatises from the period, such as Thomas of Cantimpre's 13th century encyclopedia, De Natura Rerum, included sections on the nature and management of bees, highlighting their importance. This created a garden that was humming with life. It was a diverse, insect-rich environment. This insect population didn't just pollinate it, also provided natural pest control. Many of the flies, wasps, and beetles attracted by the flowers were predators or parasites of the very insects that ate the crops. By creating a welcoming home for a wide range of insects, the gardener was building a self-regulating system. But are we missing a piece of the puzzle? We know bees are attracted to flowers, but does the specific combination of nectar and pollen from a diverse mix of medieval herbs and weeds provide a more complete and healthful diet for them than modern ornamental flowers, making them stronger and more resilient to disease? Could the presence of a beehive in a garden have effects beyond pollination, perhaps through the dispersal of yeasts or other microbes from the hive into the local environment? And is it possible that the sound and vibration of a buzzing hive has a subtle, positive effect on the growth and development of the surrounding plants, a phenomenon some modern researchers are just beginning to investigate under the name of acoustics in agriculture? Number 6, how did they test their soil without a lab? A modern gardener wanting to know about their soil can take a sample, put it in a bag, and mail it to a lab. A few weeks later, they'll get a detailed report on pH, nutrient levels, and organic matter content. A medieval gardener had a different set of tools: their eyes, their hands, and their nose. They performed a sophisticated sensory analysis of their soil that gave them all the information they needed. First, they used their eyes. They looked at the color. A dark blackish soil was a good sign. They knew from experience that dark soil, the kind that came from the bottom of the compost heap or from a well-managed bed, was rich and fertile. They didn't know the term humus, but they knew the color of life. A pale, sandy, or reddish clay soil told them it was lacking in organic matter and would need to be built up. They also looked at what was already growing there. Certain weeds are indicator plants. For example, the presence of sheep sorrel or plantain often indicates acidic, compacted soil. The sight of nettles or fat hen, on the other hand, signals a rich, fertile soil high in nitrogen. They read the landscape like a book. Second, they used their hands. They would take a handful of soil and feel it. They would crumble it. Does it hold together or fall apart? They would squeeze it. Does it form a tight, sticky ball or a loose, crumbly one? This told them about its texture, the relative amounts of sand, silt, and clay. A good loam, the ideal garden soil, feels slightly gritty, slightly smooth, and holds its shape when squeezed but crumbles easily when poked. They would also feel its moisture content. Is it dust dry or waterlogged? This sense of touch, developed over years of practice, gave them an intuitive understanding of the soil's structure and its ability to hold water. The Roman writer Columella, in his work De Re Rustica from the 1st century AD, gives detailed instructions on assessing soil quality by its feel and stickiness, advice that was preserved and copied in monastic libraries throughout the Middle Ages. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they used their nose. A healthy, living soil has a distinct smell. It's that rich, sweet, earthy scent that you get after a rainstorm. That smell is produced by a class of soil bacteria called actinomycetes, which release a compound called geosmin. The presence of this smell is a direct indicator of a healthy, active microbial community. It is literally the smell of life. If the soil smelled sour or rotten, it meant it was anaerobic and waterlogged. If it had no smell at all, it was likely dead and depleted of organic matter. The nose knew the difference between a living soil and a dead one. This sensory approach gave the gardener an intimate, holistic understanding of their soil. It wasn't a list of abstract numbers on a page, it was a living relationship. They knew their soil, like they knew their own family. This deep familiarity allowed them to make decisions in real time. This bed feels a bit heavy. It needs more sand or compost to lighten it up. This patch smells weak. It needs a good dose from the midden heap. It was a constant conversation between the gardener and the land. But what were they sensing that we can't measure? Could the human hand, with its complex array of nerves, be detecting subtle properties of soil structure, like its electrostatic charge or its microbial film, that our mechanical tests miss? Is the human nose capable of detecting a whole suite of volatile organic compounds released by the soil microbiome, giving a far more detailed report on its health and composition than we realize? And what if the act of regularly touching and smelling the soil creates a feedback loop, inoculating the gardener's own microbiome with beneficial soil organisms, which in turn could subtly enhance their health and even their intuitive ability to garden? Number 5, what was the point of a sunken path? When we think of a raised garden bed, we focus on the bed itself. It's a box or a mound of soil lifted above the surrounding ground. But for the medieval gardener who used this system, the path between the beds was just as important as the bed itself. The design wasn't just raised beds, it was a system of beds and sunken paths, and the two worked together. The raised beds themselves had obvious benefits, many of which we've already touched upon. They provided deep, uncompacted soil for plant roots. They warmed up faster in the spring. They drained well in wet climates, but the sunken paths were the secret to making the whole system work, especially when it came to water. In a wet climate, like in much of medieval Britain, the sunken paths acted as drainage channels. Excess water from the beds would seep into the paths, preventing the soil from becoming waterlogged and the plant roots from rotting. The paths kept the growing area from turning into a swamp. In a dry climate, the paths served the opposite function. They became water harvesting channels. When it did rain, water from the surrounding area would be directed into the paths. The gardener could then scoop this water out and put it on the beds, or more cleverly, let it sit there and slowly soak into soil, hydrating the beds from the sides and from below. Some historians and archaeologists believe that this design is a precursor to more formal, keyline design principles, which aim to slow, spread, and sink water across a landscape. The paths became miniature reservoirs. The paths were also a source of fertility. They were typically filled with a rough organic material like wood chips, sawdust, or straw. This material served several purposes. It suppressed weeds in the path, it made a clean, dry surface to walk on. And most importantly, it slowly decomposed. Like, as people walked on the paths, this material was broken down and compacted. Every year or two, the gardener would scoop out this rich, half-composted material from the paths and spread it on top of the beds, feeding the soil. Then they would refill the paths with fresh material. The paths were, in effect, slow composting trenches that turned foot traffic into fertilizer. This system is described in some of the earliest detailed gardening texts we have. The Capitular de Villis, a decree issued by Charlemagne around the year 800, provides a long list of plants to be grown on the royal estates. The management of these gardens, with their intensive raised bed systems, required this kind of practical space-saving efficiency. The design of beds and paths maximized growing area while integrating water management and fertility creation into the very layout of the garden. You never stepped on the growing beds, which meant the soil was never compacted. All the work outplanting, weeding, harvesting was done from the paths, so the empty space wasn't wasted space. It was an active, functional part of the garden machine, working as a drain, a reservoir, and a compost generator. But what other functions did this design serve? Did the temperature and moisture difference between the warm, dry beds and the cool, moist paths create air currents that helped to circulate air and reduce fungal diseases? Could the decomposing wood in the paths have fostered a specific community of mycorrhizal fungi that then spread into the beds, forming beneficial partnerships with the vegetable roots? And is it possible that the sunken paths acted as a safe harbor for beneficial creatures like ground beetles and toads, providing them with a cool, damp, protected environment right in the heart of the garden where they could best control slugs and other pests? Number 4, how did a simple knife shape a forest? A modern gardener might have a shed full of tools, gas-powered tillers, electric trimmers, a dozen different types of spades and forks. The medieval gardener had a much simpler toolkit. For many tasks, their most important and versatile tool was a simple, sharp knife, specifically a billhook. A billhook is a tool with a curved blade, a sort of cross between a knife, an axe, and a sickle. It has been used in Europe since the Iron Age. Its shape is perfectly designed for a wide range of tasks. With a swing, it can chop through a thick branch. With a pull, it can cut through brambles and vines. The hook tip can be used to drag cut branches out of a thicket. It was the original multi-tool. And in the hands of a skilled user, it could not only clear land but also manage it for sustainable production. One of its most important uses was in coppicing and pollarding. As we mentioned with wattle fences, coppicing is the practice of cutting certain trees like hazel, willow, and sweet chestnut down to a stump. The tree then sends up a profusion of new straight stems. These stems could be harvested every 7 to 15 years for a variety of essential products: firewood, charcoal, fence posts, tool handles, and of course the flexible weavers for wattle. A well-managed coppice wood was a constant, sustainable source of wood products. The billhook was the perfect tool for harvesting these stems cleanly and efficiently. Pollarding is a similar practice, but the tree is cut higher up, above the reach of browsing animals like deer. The iconic pollarded willows you see along rivers in old European landscapes are a testament to this ancient practice. The billhook was also used for hedging. Hedges were not just decorative borders, they were living fences, essential for containing livestock and marking property boundaries. To keep a hedge thick and impenetrable, it had to be laid. This involved partially cutting through the stems of the hedge plants, like hawthorn or blackthorn, and then bending them over and weaving them between stakes. The billhook shape was ideal for making this precise cut. A well-laid hedge would continue to grow, forming a dense, living barrier that was stock-proof and long-lasting. The enclosure acts in England, starting in the Tudor period and accelerating in the 18th century, led to the creation of thousands of miles of these hedges, fundamentally reshaping the landscape. In the garden, the billhook was used for pruning fruit trees, clearing rough ground, sharpening stakes, and even harvesting some crops. It was a tool of creation as much as of destruction. The simplicity of the tool fostered a deep level of skill and connection. A person who worked with a billhook all day had an intimate physical knowledge of the wood. They were cutting its grain, its hardness, its flexibility. It was a quiet, direct relationship between the person, the tool, and the plant. This reliance on a few simple, human-powered tools created a different kind of landscape and a different kind of person. It was a world built on a human scale. We have gained enormous power with our machines, but we have lost the intimate skill and the deep, physical understanding that comes from working with a simple tool like a billhook. But does this focus on hand tools have other, less obvious benefits? Does the clean, slicing cut of a sharp billhook heal more quickly and allow a tree to recover better than the ragged, tearing action of a chainsaw? Could the slow, deliberate pace of working with hand tools allow a person to observe their environment more closely, noticing subtle signs of plant health or insect activity that are missed when one is rushing with a loud machine? And what if the very act of using your own body's strength to manage a landscape creates a sense of stewardship and responsibility that is fundamentally different from the detachment that comes with push-button mechanization? Number 3, why did they think some plants were friends? We have already discussed the jumbled polyculture nature of the medieval garden, but the idea of companion planting went beyond the purely practical aspects of pest control and nitrogen fixation. It was part of a deeper worldview that saw plants as having relationships, sympathies, and antipathies, much like people. Some plants just seem to like growing next to each other. This idea is beautifully articulated in the writings of the 13th century scholar and scientist Albertus Magnus. In his work De Vegetabilis, he moved beyond simple lists of plants and their uses. He was a keen observer of the natural world, and he tried to understand how plants interacted with their environment and with each other. He noted, for example, that some plants seem to rejoice in the presence of others, growing more vigorously when they are near. This was pre-scientific language, of course, but it was based on careful observation. A classic example from medieval garden lore is the relationship between roses and garlic. The gardeners swore that planting garlic at the base of a rose bush made the roses healthier and more fragrant, and helped to keep away aphids. Modern science can now offer an explanation. Garlic produces sulfur compounds that have fungicidal and pesticidal properties. It's possible that these compounds are taken up by the rose or that their presence in the soil deters pests. The strong smell may also confuse aphids trying to find the rose bush. Another traditional pairing is carrots and rosemary. The strong scent of rosemary is said to repel the carrot root fly, one of the most destructive pests of carrots. Conversely, the smell of the carrots may help to deter pests that bother the rosemary. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. Basil planted near tomatoes was said to improve both the growth and the flavor of the tomatoes, a claim that many modern gardeners still firmly believe. These pairings were not just about pest control, they were about creating a thriving, cooperative community of plants. The medieval gardeners saw their garden as a society, not a factory floor. This perspective is fundamentally different from the modern industrial view of agriculture, which sees plants as isolated units of production, and anything that interferes with them as a problem to be eliminated. The medieval view was more holistic, more ecological. It assumed that the health of the individual depended on the health of the community. This knowledge was a form of folk science, built up over countless generations of gardeners watching their plants and noticing what worked. It was passed down through oral tradition and recorded in herbals and gardening manuals. While not every traditional pairing has stood up to scientific scrutiny, a surprising number have. The field of allelopathy, which studies the chemical interactions between plants, is now providing a scientific basis for many of these ancient practices. For example, a 2010 study in the journal Biological Agriculture and Horticulture found that intercropping with certain aromatic herbs did significantly reduce pest populations on vegetable crops. So, when a medieval gardener tucked a marigold in next to their beans, they weren't just decorating. They were matchmaking, they were practicing a kind of plant sociology, but what are the truly hidden mechanisms behind these successful plant friendships? We talk about smells and chemicals, but could there be more? Do the root systems of friendly plants communicate through electrical signals or the exchange of complex chemical messengers via the soil's fungal network? Is it possible that certain plant pairings create a unique combined microbiome in the soil around their roots that unlocks nutrients or provides disease protection in a way that neither plant could achieve alone? And what if the light reflected from the leaves of one plant has a specific wavelength that positively affects the photosynthetic activity of its neighbor? Number 2, how did they garden in the winter? For many modern gardeners in temperate climates, the garden goes to sleep in the winter. The ground freezes, the plants die back, and we wait for spring. But the medieval gardener who depended on their plot for year-round sustenance couldn't afford to take a 4-month vacation. They had to find ways to extend the harvest and even to grow fresh food in the coldest, darkest months of the year. One of their key technologies was the cold frame. A cold frame is essentially a bottomless box with a removable transparent lid. The box would be built against a south-facing wall to maximize sun exposure. The lid, or light, was not made of glass, which was too expensive, but of more accessible materials. Sometimes it was a wooden frame covered with oiled paper or thinly scraped animal horn, which were translucent. The frame would be placed over a patch of hardy winter greens like certain types of lettuce, spinach, or kale. The principle is simple. During the day, sunlight passes through the translucent lid and warms the air and soil inside the box. At night, the lid traps the heat, keeping the plants inside from freezing. On a sunny winter day, the temperature inside a cold frame can be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than the outside air. This creates a protected microclimate that allows hardy vegetables to survive and even continue to grow slowly throughout the winter. Another technique was the use of hotbeds. This was a more advanced version of the cold frame, a kind of biological central heating. The gardener would, dig a pit about 2 or 3 feet deep and fill it tightly with fresh horse manure. The manure would then be covered with a layer of good soil, and the cold frame box and light would be placed on top. As the fresh manure began to decompose, it would generate a significant amount of heat. This microbial activity could keep the soil in the hotbed warm for several months, even in the dead of winter. This allowed medieval gardeners to do things that seem amazing even to us. They could grow fresh salads and tender herbs right through the snow. They could also use the hotbeds to start seeds for spring crops, like cabbages and onions, much earlier than would otherwise be possible. The Parisian market gardeners of the 17th and 18th centuries perfected this technique, creating a system of intensive hotbed cultivation, documented by writers like Jean-Baptiste de la Quintinie, the gardener for King Louis XIV at Versailles, that could produce fresh vegetables for the city year-round. but the basic principle was known and used in monasteries and wealthy households much earlier. They also made smart use of their storage crops. Root cellars, cool, dark, and humid, were essential for preserving the main harvest of root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips, as well as apples and cabbages. But some crops were stored right in the garden. Leeks, parsnips, and certain types of kale are incredibly cold hardy. Their flavor is even said to improve after a few frosts. These crops would be left in the ground, and the gardener would simply go out and dig them up as needed, even if they had to brush snow off them first. They were a living, fresh food source available all winter. Through these techniques, protection, heat generation, and clever storage, the medieval garden remained a productive space, even in the harshest weather. It was a testament to their ingenuity and their deep need to get as much as they could from their small patch of land. But what don't we know about these winter gardens? Does the slow, low-light growth of a vegetable in a cold frame change its nutritional profile, perhaps concentrating certain vitamins or phytonutrients? Could the specific mix of gases released by the decomposing manure in a hotbed, like carbon dioxide, have a fertilizing effect on the air inside the frame, boosting plant growth? And is it possible that the plants that are hardy enough to survive being harvested from frozen ground have unique genetic or epigenetic traits that could be valuable in developing more resilient crops for our own, more volatile climate? Number one, why did they build their gardens on a pile of wood? This sounds like the strangest tip of all. Why would you bury a huge pile of logs and branches and then try to make a garden on top of it? It seems counterintuitive, but this practice, which has been rediscovered and named Hugelkultur German for mound culture, is a medieval European technique for building incredibly fertile, self-sustaining garden beds that last for decades. The process starts by digging a trench or simply laying material on the ground. Large logs and thick branches, preferably from hardwood trees that are starting to rot, are laid down first. On top of that go smaller branches, twigs, and other woody debris. This forms the core of the mound. Then, the gardener starts layering other organic materials on top, just like in a no-dig bed. The layers of turf placed upside down, manure, kitchen scraps, leaves, straw, and finally a thick layer of compost or topsoil to plant into. The result is a large, tall mound, which can be several feet high. What happens next is a slow, magical process. The wood in the core of the mound begins to break down. This is not a fast, hot composting process. It's a slow, fungal decomposition that takes years, even decades. As the wood rots, it does several amazing things. First, it becomes like a sponge. It soaks up water during rainy periods and holds it deep within the mound. During dry periods, it slowly releases this water back to the plant roots. A mature hugelkultur bed rarely, if ever, needs to be watered. It is a self-irrigating system. Second, the slow decomposition of the wood generates a small but steady amount of heat, warming the soil from below. This can extend the growing season, allowing for earlier planting in the spring and later harvesting in the fall. Third, as the wood and the other organic layers break down, they release a slow, steady stream of nutrients for the plants growing on top. A hugelkultur bed is a self-fertilizing system that will remain incredibly fertile for 20 years or more. Finally, as the wood breaks down and settles over time, it creates a wonderfully aerated, fluffy soil structure full of air pockets that are perfect for plant roots and soil life. This technique was likely used in the forested regions of Germany and Eastern Europe for centuries. It's a way of taking waste wood from clearing land and turning it into a long-term fertility engine. It mimics the natural process of a large tree falling in the forest and slowly rotting, creating a nurse log on which new life thrives. Sepp Holzer, an Austrian farmer known for his work in permaculture, has been a major modern popularizer of the technique, using it to create productive ecosystems in a wide range of climates. A hugelkultur mound is a long-term investment in the health of your land. It takes a lot of work to build, but once it's established, it is one of the most low-maintenance, resilient, and productive gardening systems ever devised. It is the ultimate expression of the medieval principle of using everything, wasting nothing, and working with nature's own processes to create abundance. But the deepest questions are still unanswered. Does the massive, concentrated core of rotting wood in a hugelkultur bed create a unique and incredibly powerful fungal network that we find nowhere else, a kind of super mycorrhizal highway? Could this fungal network be actively mining minerals from the deep subsoil and transporting them up into the bed? And as the wood decomposes over 20 years, does it go through different stages, each supporting a different community of microbes and releasing a different profile of nutrients, creating a dynamic, evolving ecosystem that perfectly supports the changing needs of a long-term garden? What other secrets of slow decomposition are we still to uncover?